In this video, we are going to examine topic 7.10, speciation. Speciation may occur when two populations become reproductively isolated from each other. This is represented by our original population, which is the green circle. Due to a barrier, such as a geographical barrier, this population has been split into two groups. Over evolutionary time, these two groups evolve independently of one another and become reproductively isolated, and eventually forming two separate species represented by the green and the blue circle. The definition of a biological species is a population whose members can interbreed and can produce a viable, fertile offspring. Now remember that term, viable, fertile offspring. We'll look at that in later slides. There are two proposed models of speciation. The first model is called the gradualism. This is when evolution occurs at a slow rate over hundreds, thousands, or maybe even millions of years. And this is demonstrated by the change in the color of the butterfly's wings. You can see that the butterflies start off as one species, and over generation after generation after generation, the two species evolve independently such that one becomes the orange and brown butterfly and the other becomes the brown and the white butterfly. And you can see these incremental changes from generation to generation to generation. This is called the gradualism model. That's in contrast to the punctated equilibrium model. In this particular model, we can see that evolution occurs in these rapid spats. And then there are long periods at which basically the population is under stasis. No major changes happen within these species. And this is shown here on the right-hand side of my diagram. You can see that there are these major changes such that the brown and orange butterfly, brown and white, basically in one or two generations. And then for many, many generations, it stays the same. Now, in reality, both of these models can coexist in different species depending upon the scenarios or the environmental pressures that they find themselves within. Divergent evolution occurs when adaptations to new habitats result in a phenotypical diversification. Speciation rates can be especially rapid during times of adaptive radiation as a new habitat becomes available. So what exactly is adaptive radiation? Well, adaptive radiation happens when a single or a few species rapidly evolve into many new species. This can occur when a species migrates to a new area. This usually occurs after a major extinction event, or can occur when new habitats become available, such as a volcanic eruption occurs and creates a new island. As these new species arrive in this new habitat, there are lots of resources for them to take advantage of. And because there are many habitats and resources freely available to them, the population is going to evolve independently upon one another, and we're going to result in lots of different species. This occurred when the marsupials first arrived on the Australian continent. As you can see today, there are many different types of marsupials. These include the koala, the kangaroo, the sugar glider, the Tasmanian devil. These all, in theory, originate from one common ancestor that arrived at the Australian island. Because the island had different evolutionary pressures, they are able to adapt to those new environments and take advantage of the resources available to them. Speciation results in the diversity of life forms on our planet. As you and I know, there are so many different types of animals and plants and fungi and bacteria that live on our planet. Because our planet has many different types of habitats, and these species have evolved to occupy these habitats and take advantage of the resources that are available in those areas. Speciation can occur using two mechanisms. The first mechanism is called allopatric speciation. Alio means other. So in this situation, a population forms a new species after being geographically isolated from its parent population. An example of this is a geographic barrier such as a river. So imagine that we have a population and some geographical event happens and it causes a river smack down in the middle of the population. So our original parental population is now split. We have the green beetles on the left and the blue beetles on the right. That is called an allelopatриc speciation. Allo is other place. That's in contrast to the sympatриc speciation. In the situation of a sim means same. So a subset or small group of the population forms a new species without geographical separation. So the major difference between allelopatриc and sympatриc is the physical barrier that separates the population. In a sympatриc speciation process, no physical separation occurs between the two species. And we'll talk about how this sympatриc speciation can occur. So in order for speciation to happen, there are what we call the prezygotic and postzygotic mechanisms. And these can maintain the reproductive isolation and prevent gene flow between populations. This is how species form. For our instance here, we're going to assume that prezygotic occurs before the egg is fertilized, and postzygotic is after fertilization happens. So the prezygotic barriers impede mating or hinder the fertilization if mating does occur. So there are 5 barriers that prevent this from happening. These include habitat, temporal, behavior, mechanical, and gametic. And over the next couple of slides, we're going to discuss each of them individually. So the first one here is habitat isolation. Habitat isolation occurs when the species live in the same region, so this would be sympatриc, but occur at different habitats, so they rarely encounter each other. An example of this would be on the left-hand side here. We have 2 garter snakes. The one garter snake lives near or in the water, and the other one is a terrestrial, so it lives on the ground. And because they occupy different habitats within the same region, they rarely interact with one another, and therefore they do not mate. And they are considered individual species for that reason. Another example are the lions and tigers. Lions live in the grasslands of the savanna, and tigers live in the rainforest or in the jungles. Now, because they occupy different habitats, these 2 big cats do not mate in nature. And yes, I know you've probably have heard of a liger. That does occur in a zoo-like habitat. They can actually mate, but naturally this does not occur, and that's why these are considered 2 separate species. The next example here is called temporal isolation. This occurs when species that breed during different times of the day, night versus day, different seasons, or different years cannot mix their gametes. So the example I have here are the 2 different skunks. On the top is the eastern spotted skunk, and on the bottom is the western spotted skunk. These are 2 different species, and the reason they're different species is because the eastern prefers to mate during the winter months, whereas the western prefers to mate during the late summer months. Because they don't want to mate at the same time, these are considered separate species. They would normally interact and produce an offspring. Our next barrier is called behavioral isolation. So these are unique behavioral patterns or rituals that isolate a species. Behaviors identify members of the same species. They attract mates of the same species. These include courtships, rituals, or mating calls. Okay. One of the best examples is the blue-footed boobies. And if you get a chance, watch a YouTube video on them. They have this very unique courtship in which they dance with their blue feet, and that will attract a mate. And this seems funny to you and I, but to the blue-footed boobies, this is how they interact with one another. And the next one is mechanical isolation. So these are morphological differences that prevent mating from occurring. So up until this point, we have prevented mating or courtship from happening. This mechanism, mechanical isolation and gametic isolation, happen after mating occurs. So in this situation, mating between two closely related species is inhibited because their genitalia are not compatible. Now, if you want to think about this, this is really a square peg in a round hole scenario. A couple examples of this include these two species of monkey flowers. They differ greatly in their shape and color, and therefore it prevents cross-pollination. So for example, this hummingbird is only able to pollinate the red monkey flowers and not the pink monkey flowers because the shape of the flowers is distinctively different. So that's what we call mechanical isolation. And the final prezygotic isolation barrier is what we call the gametic isolation. So this is where the sperm of one species may or may not be able to fertilize the egg of the other species. So the fusion between the egg and the sperm is hindered even though there is geographical proximity. So a couple of ways that this can occur is a biochemical barrier. For some reason the sperm is unable to penetrate the egg, or possibly a chemical incompatibility. The sperm cannot survive the female reproductive tract and is therefore unable to successfully fertilize the egg. Example in nature includes sea urchins. So sea urchins actually release their sperm into the water, and these sperms try to fertilize eggs in the surrounding area. If the sea urchins are not the same species, the sperm is unable to successfully penetrate the egg and complete fertilization. So that's how the two species of sea urchins are able to prevent fertilization from occurring. So those are the 5 prezygotic barriers. If fertilization successfully occurs, we then are focused on the postzygotic mechanisms that can prevent reproductive isolation. These include reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and lastly, the hybrid breakdown. So these barriers prevent a hybrid zygote from developing into a viable, fertile adult. Remember I talked about those definition earlier, the idea of a viable, fertile adult. So the first example here is the reduced hybrid viability. So genes of different parent species can interact and impair a hybrid's development. So in this situation, we have 2 different species of salamanders. They mate, they produce an offspring. However, the offspring, which is a hybrid now, actually is short-lived. So it is born, it is feeble, and it dies early in life. So that would be called reduced hybrid viability. The next is reduced hybrid fertility. So in this situation, even if hybrids are vigorous, they may be sterile. That is the example of a mule. So we know that a horse and a donkey can reproduce, and the offspring that they produce is called a mule. However, a mule is sterile, so it can't produce offspring of its own. And the reason this happens is because of the chromosome numbers. The chromosomes are not compatible. A horse has 64 chromosomes, or 32 pairs, and a donkey has 62 chromosomes, or 31 pairs. So when the horse provides 32 and the donkey provides 31, you add those together, we end up with 63 chromosomes. 63 is not divisible by 2, therefore our poor mule is sterile and is unable to reproduce. Therefore, it is considered to be not considered to be a species by itself. And our third and final example of a post-zygotic barrier is what we describe as the hybrid breakdown. Hybrids may be fertile and viable in the first generation, but when they mate, offspring are feeble and sterile. So you can see the example here in the picture. On the left-hand side, that's the parent. On the right-hand side, that is the offspring. The offspring, or the first generation hybrids, are much better than the parents, and that's really an interesting concept in agriculture. However, when you take this offspring and try to produce its own offspring, they are feeble and sterile, and that's really represented by the rice there in the middle of the picture. And so this is what we call the hybrid breakdown. So these are the mechanisms that prevent species from interacting with one another. Please review these.